Close your eyes. Imagine a long, quiet hallway. The floors are polished marble, cool and smooth beneath your feet. The walls are lined with portraits, dozens of them, each one framed in dark gold, each one lit by the soft flicker of candlelight. These are the faces of the men who shaped a nation. 46 of them, farmers and lawyers, generals and scholars, men of great courage and men of terrible failure, men who rose to the highest office in the world and men who were simply not ready for it. Tonight we walk this hallway together. We take our time, there is nowhere to be, nothing to do, nowhere to rush. We simply listen to their stories. One by one we will visit each president of the United States, from the very first to the most recent, and we will understand quietly and gently where each one stands in the long arc of history. Some will surprise you. Some will comfort you. Some will remind you that even the most powerful people in the world are, at the end of the day, only human. So settle in, let your body become heavy, let your breathing slow, and let history carry you gently to sleep. The President. 1 George Washington, the foundation. The first portrait on the wall is the one everyone knows. George Washington. A tall man, serious eyes, the kind of face that seems carved from stone, and yet those who knew him said he laughed easily and that he danced beautifully at parties. He was born in 1732 in Virginia on a tobacco plantation. He never attended university. He taught himself mostly, reading late into the night, writing careful letters, learning the land around him. As a young man, he was a soldier, and not always a successful one. He lost more battles than he won in his early career, but there was something about Washington that men wanted to follow, a steadiness, a calm in chaos, a sense that he would not abandon you even when things fell apart. When the American Revolution began, he was chosen to lead the Continental Army. It was not an obvious choice, but it was the right one. For 8 years, he held that army together through cold winters, desertion, starvation, and defeat. At Valley Forge, his men wrapped their feet in rags and left bloodstains in the snow. Washington stayed with them. And eventually, they won. When the war ended, something remarkable happened. The men who had fought under Washington wanted to make him king. It would have been easy. He had the loyalty, he had the army, he had everything he needed to simply take power. He said no. He went home to his farm at Mount Vernon. That single act, the refusal of a crown, may be the most important thing any American has ever done. It set the template for what American democracy could be. Power returned peacefully. No king, no dynasty. A few years later, he was called back to serve as the first president of the United States. He served 2 terms, then stepped down again, establishing another precedent that would hold for over a century. His ranking near the very top, not because he was perfect, he was a slaveholder, and the contradiction of that fact haunts his legacy, but because without him, there may have been no nation at all. George Washington, the foundation. 2 John Adams, the underappreciated one. The second portrait is a rounder face, shorter, a little prickly around the eyes. John Adams. He was brilliant and he knew it, and that was sometimes his problem. Adams was a Massachusetts lawyer, one of the great minds of the founding era. He argued for independence before it was popular. He defended British soldiers in court after the Boston Massacre, not because he supported them, but because he believed every man deserved a fair trial. That took courage. He served as Washington's vice president for 8 years, a role he famously called the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. When he became president in 1797, he inherited a nation already full of fault lines. There were those who wanted closer ties with Britain, those who admired revolutionary France, those who feared both. Adams tried to steer a careful path down the middle and got attacked from all sides. His greatest achievement was keeping the United States out of a war with France when almost everyone around him wanted one. He sacrificed his own political career to preserve the peace. He lost his re-election because of it. His lowest point was the Alien and Sedition Acts, laws that made it illegal to criticize the government. a dark moment in a presidency that otherwise stood for principle. Adams and his great rival Thomas Jefferson died on the same day, July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Adams's last words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." He was wrong. Jefferson had died hours earlier. But Adams, the underappreciated one, was right about most of the important things. 3. Thomas Jefferson, the philosopher king. The third portrait is sharp-featured, red-haired even in old age, the eyes keen and searching. Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote that all men are created equal, while owning over 600 enslaved people across his lifetime. The contradiction at the heart of Jefferson is the contradiction at the heart of America itself, and that is perhaps why he remains so fascinating and so troubling. He was one of the greatest intellects ever to occupy the White House. He spoke 5 languages. He designed his own home, Monticello, obsessively and brilliantly. He founded the University of Virginia. He was a scientist, an architect, a musician, a philosopher. As president, his greatest act was the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, buying an enormous stretch of land from Napoleon's France that roughly doubled the size of the United States. He wasn't entirely sure it was constitutional. He did it anyway because the opportunity was too great to miss. He sent Lewis and Clark into the unknown West to map what he had bought. He reduced the national debt. He kept the country out of European wars. But he also signed the Embargo Act, a disastrous piece of legislation that crippled American trade and achieved almost nothing. And always the shadow, the enslaved people at Monticello, Sally Hemings, with whom he almost certainly had a long relationship and several children. The man who wrote the words of freedom denied that freedom to hundreds of human beings. Thomas Jefferson, brilliant, visionary, deeply flawed, one of the most important Americans who ever lived. 4. James Madison, the architect. Quiet now, another Virginia planter, but a different kind of mind. James Madison was small, 5'4", barely 100 pounds, the smallest president in American history, but his ideas were enormous. He is called the father of the Constitution because more than anyone else he designed it. He arrived at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 having read every book he could find on republics and democracies throughout history. He came prepared. He argued brilliantly. He shaped the document that would govern the most powerful nation on earth. As president, his great crisis was the War of 1812, a conflict that started badly. The British burned Washington, D.C., including the White House. Madison and his wife, Dolly, fled the Capitol ahead of the flames. Dolly famously took the famous portrait of George Washington off the wall before she left. The war ended in something of a draw, but the Battle of New Orleans, fought after the peace treaty was signed, made Andrew Jackson a hero and gave Americans a story of triumph to hold on to. Madison left office with the country intact, the Constitution holding. Not the most exciting president, but one of the most essential. 5. James Monroe, the era of good feelings. The 5th president brings a kind of peace to the hallway. James Monroe presided over what historians call the era of good feelings, a period after the War of 1812 when the United States felt, for a moment, unified. There was only one real political party. The country was expanding. Optimism was in the air. Monroe's great contribution was the Monroe Doctrine, a declaration that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open to European colonization. It was bold. It was ambitious. The United States didn't really have the military power to enforce it yet, but it planted a flag that would define American foreign policy for generations. He served 2 terms, ran essentially unopposed for his second, and left office well-liked. A good president, a calming presence, the kind of leader every country wishes it had more of. 6. John Quincy Adams, the brilliant failure. The 6th president is the son of the 2nd and carries that weight visibly. John Quincy Adams was perhaps the most qualified person ever to become president. He had served as a diplomat, a senator, and Secretary of State. He spoke multiple languages. He was a tireless worker. But he was also cold, stubborn, and politically terrible. He won the presidency in 1824 in what his opponents called the corrupt bargain, a backroom deal that gave him the election despite Andrew Jackson winning more popular votes. From the moment he took office, Jackson's supporters worked to destroy him. They succeeded. Adams served one miserable term, passed almost none of his ambitious agenda, and was voted out decisively. But here is the remarkable thing. After losing the presidency, Adams returned to public life as a congressman. And there, free from the impossible pressures of the executive office, he became one of the greatest legislators in American history. He fought slavery. He defended African captives from the Amistad. He argued for freedom on the floor of the House of Representatives when it was deeply dangerous to do so. He died at his desk in the Capitol building at the age of 80, still fighting. John Quincy Adams, a failed president, a great American. 7. Andrew Jackson, the complicated force. The seventh portrait is fierce, wild hair, a long scar on his face from a British officer who struck him as a boy when he refused to clean the man's boots. Andrew Jackson never forgot an insult. He was the first president from outside the Virginia and Massachusetts establishment, a self-made man from the frontier, a war hero, a brawler. He was shot in duels so many times that he reportedly rattled when he walked from the bullets still lodged in his body. His supporters called him a man of the people, the common man's president. His record is deeply mixed. He fought the National Bank with a passion that bordered on obsession, believing it served the wealthy at the expense of ordinary Americans. He won that fight, dismantling the bank, though economists still debate whether that was wise. He survived an assassination attempt, the first ever against a sitting president, when 2 pistols misfired at point-blank range. Jackson then beat the would-be assassin with his cane. But then there is the Trail of Tears. Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, forcibly relocating tens of thousands of Native Americans from their homelands to west of the Mississippi River. Thousands died on the journey. It was ethnic cleansing. It was one of the great crimes in American history, and it was carried out under his direct order. Andrew Jackson, a man of immense force and genuine courage, and also of terrible cruelty. History holds both. 8. Martin Van Buren, the magician. The 8th president is smoother, better dressed, a politician through and through. Martin Van Buren was called the Little Magician for his ability to maneuver through political situations. He was a master of backroom dealing, coalition building, the hidden levers of power. He had the misfortune, however, of becoming president just in time for the Panic of 1837, one of the worst economic crises in American history up to that point. Banks failed, unemployment soared. Van Buren's response was slow and inadequate. He served 1 term and was not re-elected. A skilled political operator who was ultimately undone by forces beyond his control. History remembers him kindly enough, but not warmly. 9. William Henry Harrison, the briefest chapter. The 9th portrait is distinguished, but somehow unfinished. William Henry Harrison served 31 days as president. He gave the longest inaugural address in American history, nearly 2 hours, outdoors in freezing rain without a hat or coat, determined to prove at 68 years old that he was vigorous and strong. He contracted pneumonia. He died on April 4, 1841. 31 days, the shortest presidency in American history. We will never know what kind of president he would have been. His entire legacy is a cautionary tale about the stubbornness of old men in cold weather. Rest well, General Harrison. 10. John T. Wiley, the accidental president. The 10th portrait has a slight tension in the jaw, the look of a man who knows he is not entirely welcome where he stands. John Tyler became president by accident, the first to do so, and almost no one was happy about it. When Harrison died, Tyler assumed the presidency with full confidence and authority. His opponents called him His Accidency. His own party eventually expelled him. He was the only president to serve without the support of any political party. He accomplished some things. The annexation of Texas began under his watch, but he was largely isolated and ineffective. In his later years, he became a member of the Confederate government, the only former U.S. president to die fighting against the Union. Because of this, the United States government did not officially acknowledge his death for many years. A complicated, isolated figure, history has not been especially kind. 11. James K. Polk, the underdog overachiever. James K. Polk is one of the most underrated presidents in American history. He came to office in 1844 as a dark horse. Almost no one expected him to win the Democratic nomination, let alone the presidency. He was a one-term congressman from Tennessee, protege of Andrew Jackson, not particularly charismatic, not particularly beloved. But he was extraordinarily effective. Before taking office, Polk made a list of 4 things he wanted to accomplish: acquire California and the Southwest from Mexico, settle the Oregon border with Britain, lower tariffs, and establish an independent federal treasury. He accomplished all 4 in one term. He worked himself nearly to death doing it. He was one of the most diligent, relentless workers ever to occupy the White House, often working 16-hour days. He took almost no vacation. He chose not to seek a second term. He left office and died 99 days later at 53 years old, almost certainly from sheer exhaustion. The Mexican-American War he started has its critics. It was, many argued, a war of imperial aggression that vastly expanded American territory at the expense of Mexico. That shadow is real. But by the narrow measure of a president who said what he would do and then did it, Polk is remarkable. 12. Zachrytaylor, the general who barely arrived. Another general, another short presidency. Zachary Taylor was a career military man who had never voted in a presidential election before winning one. He was a hero of the Mexican-American War, tough and plain-spoken. He served 16 months before dying in office in 1850, likely from acute gastroenteritis after eating contaminated food at a 4th of July ceremony. He had, in his brief time, shown some promise, surprising his Southern supporters by refusing to simply expand slavery into new territories. He died before we could find out what he might have done. Another unfinished chapter. 13. Millard Fillmore, the one nobody remembers. The 13th portrait, almost nobody can name him without help. Millard Fillmore, the other accidental president of this era. He signed the Compromise of 1850, which included the deeply controversial Fugitive Slave Act, requiring northern states to return escaped enslaved people to their owners. It was an attempt to hold the country together. It satisfied nobody and angered nearly everyone. He is consistently ranked among the worst presidents in surveys of historians, not because he was malicious, but because he was inadequate for the moment he faced. History needed greatness. History got Millard Fillmore. 14. Franklin Pierce, the handsome tragedy. The 14th president is strikingly good-looking in his portrait and deeply sad. Franklin Pierce came to the White House carrying a grief so heavy it is difficult to imagine. Just weeks before his inauguration, he and his wife watched their 11-year-old son Benny die in a train accident before their eyes. His wife, Jane, never recovered. She spent much of his presidency in seclusion, writing letters to her dead son. Pierce himself turned increasingly to alcohol. His presidency was a disaster. He signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which effectively reopened the question of slavery in new territories and unleashed a wave of violence that would become known as Bleeding Kansas. The country moved visibly closer to civil war. He was not renominated by his own party. He died, largely forgotten, in 1869. A sad, sympathetic, ultimately inadequate figure. 15. James Buchanan, the man who watched it burn. The 15th portrait has the eyes of a man who knows the history books are not going to be kind. James Buchanan is consistently ranked as the worst president in American history, or very close to it. And the reason is simple. He watched the country slide towards civil war and did almost nothing. Southern states began seceding after the election of Lincoln in 1860. Buchanan's position was essentially that secession was illegal, but that the federal government had no power to stop it. This is not a defensible legal position. It is barely a position at all. He spent the last months of his presidency paralyzed, waiting for Lincoln to take over, hoping the crisis would somehow resolve itself. It did not. He retired to Pennsylvania as the war began, the last president to have been born in the 18th century, a man almost perfectly unsuited to the moment history handed him. 16. Abraham Lincoln, the Titan. We stop here longer than anywhere else. The 16th portrait is the one you know. Tall, impossibly lean, deep-set eyes that look like they have seen everything sorrowful that the world contains, and decided to carry it anyway. Abraham Lincoln. There are presidents, and then there is Lincoln. He occupies a category almost by himself. He was born in a log cabin in Kentucky in 1809. His mother died when he was 9. His family moved and moved again, always poor, always just surviving. He had almost no formal education. He taught himself to read, taught himself law, read by firelight until his eyes ached. He failed in business. He failed in early politics. He suffered severe bouts of depression, what he called the hypos, so dark that his friends sometimes hid sharp objects from him. And yet he kept going. He became a lawyer, a good one. He became a congressman. He debated Stephen Douglas across Illinois in 1858 in a series of conversations so profound and so important that they are still read today. He lost that Senate race, but the country had heard his voice. In 1860, he became the 16th President of the United States, and within months, the South was seceding and the nation was at war with itself. What Lincoln did over the next 4 years, holding the Union together through the bloodiest conflict in American history, navigating the politics of a fractured country, growing from a cautious moderate to the man who issued the Emancipation Proclamation, is one of the great stories of human leadership. He was not perfect. He suspended habeas corpus. He moved slowly on emancipation. He made mistakes. But he also held the line. He chose Grant when others wouldn't. He wrote the Gettysburg Address in the middle of catastrophe and somehow made it sound like hope. He won re-election in 1864, when many thought he would lose. He was shot on April 14, 1865, 5 days after the Confederate surrender. He died the following morning. He was 56 years old. The 16th president, the one historians most consistently rank first. Abraham Lincoln, let his name rest with you for a moment before we move on. 17. Andrew Johnson, the bitter aftermath. The man who followed Lincoln carries the weight of that contrast everywhere he goes. Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's vice president, a Southern Democrat chosen for the ticket to symbolize national unity. He was drunk at the inauguration. That was a sign. When Lincoln was killed, Johnson inherited Reconstruction, the enormous, delicate task of bringing the defeated South back into the Union while protecting the rights of 4 million newly freed Black Americans. He failed catastrophically. He vetoed civil rights legislation repeatedly. He undermined the Freedmen's Bureau. He allowed Southern states to pass black codes that reduced formerly enslaved people to something barely distinguishable from their previous condition. He did almost everything in his power to undo the gains of the Civil War. He was impeached by the House of Representatives in 1868, the first president to face impeachment, and was acquitted in the Senate by a single vote. He is consistently ranked among the worst presidents in American history. The judgment is fair. 18. Ulysses S. Grant, the redeemed general. The 18th president has been treated more kindly by history in recent decades than he was for much of the 20th century. Ulysses Grant was the greatest Union general of the Civil War, the man Lincoln finally found who would fight, who would not back down, who understood that winning required an awful relentlessness. Without Grant, the war's outcome may have been different. As president, his record is mixed, but better than once thought. His administration was marked by significant corruption, not by Grant personally, who was honest, but by those around him who took advantage of his loyalty and trust. The Whiskey Ring, the Credit-Mobilier scandal, Grant's presidency became synonymous with Gilded Age graft. But Grant himself was genuinely committed to Reconstruction and to the rights of Black Americans. He used federal power aggressively against the Ku Klux Klan. He enforced civil rights legislation. He tried. When Reconstruction ended and the country abandoned its commitment to equality, it was not Grant who failed, it was the country around him. He left office, went bankrupt in a financial swindle, and spent his final years dying of throat cancer while racing to finish his memoirs so that his wife would have money to live on. Mark Twain published them. They are considered among the finest military memoirs ever written. He finished the manuscript 4 days before he died. Ulysses Grant, more than his reputation suggested for a long time. 19. Rutherford B. Hayes, The Compromise. The 19th president came to power through one of the most contested elections in American history. The 1876 election between Hayes and Samuel Tilden was so disputed, with multiple Southern states submitting rival electoral slates, that it was ultimately resolved by a congressional commission and a backroom deal. Hayes became president. In exchange, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction was effectively ended. The Compromise of 1877, as it became known, had enormous consequences. The withdrawal of federal protection allowed Southern states to systematically strip Black Americans of the rights they had gained. The era of Jim Crow laws began. Hayes himself was a decent, honest man who served competently and kept his promise to serve only 1 term, but his presidency arrived soaked in the blood of a compromised democracy. 20. James Garfield, The One We'll Never Know. Another unfinished presidency. James Garfield served 200 days before being shot by a disappointed office seeker, Charles Guiteau, at a Washington train station in July 1881. He did not die immediately. He lingered for 11 weeks, the country anxiously following his condition. What killed him, historians now believe, was not the bullet, which had lodged harmlessly near his spine, but the repeated unsanitary probing of the wound by his doctors, who introduced fatal infection searching for a bullet they never found. Alexander Graham Bell attempted to locate the bullet with a metal-detecting device he invented. It couldn't find it because the coiled springs in Garfield's metal-framed bed kept triggering a false positive. Garfield died on September 19, 1881. He had been, by many accounts, one of the more promising men to reach the presidency. We will never know. 21. Chester Arthur, the surprising one. Chester Arthur is another president almost nobody remembers, which is unjust because he surprised everyone. He came to power through the corrupt political machine of New York. His reputation was as a party hack, a man who handed out government jobs to political allies regardless of qualification. As president, he did the opposite. He signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, the first meaningful attempt to make government employment based on merit rather than political patronage. He reformed the institution he had once benefited from. His former allies never forgave him. A genuinely surprising president, a man who grew into the office. 22 and 24. Grover Cleveland, the stubborn one. We pause here because Grover Cleveland is the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, the 22nd and 24th president. He was stubborn, honest to a fault, and deeply suspicious of government spending and overreach. He vetoed more bills than all previous presidents combined. He stands for a certain kind of principled, difficult independence, not always right, but rarely dishonest. His presidency was bookended by the man in the next portrait. 23. Benjamin Harrison, the sandwiched president. Benjamin Harrison, grandson of William Henry Harrison, served between Cleveland's 2 terms. His presidency saw the admission of 6 new states to the Union, the highest single-term total in history. He also signed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first federal law attempting to regulate monopolies. History has not made him a giant, but the country was larger when he left than when he arrived. 25. William McKinley, The Bridge. The 25th portrait is solid, prosperous-looking, the face of a country beginning to feel its power. William McKinley presided over the Spanish-American War of 1898, which transformed the United States from a continental nation into a global one. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines came under American influence or control. It was the beginning of American empire, for better and worse. McKinley was assassinated in September 1901 by an anarchist named Leon C. Czolgosz at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. He was shot twice while shaking hands with members of the public in a receiving line. He died 8 days later. He was 58. His death brought to the presidency a man who would shake the 20th century. 26. Theodorosevelt, The Whirlwind. Here the hallway seems to vibrate slightly, as if the portrait itself cannot quite contain its subject. Theodore Roosevelt. He became president at 42, the youngest ever to hold the office, and he exploded into it like a force of nature. He was a sickly, asthmatic child who transformed himself through sheer determination into a boxer, a cowboy, a soldier, a big game hunter, an explorer. He once delivered a 90-minute speech after being shot in the chest. He explored the uncharted river of doubt in the Amazon at 55 and nearly died. As president, he took on the great monopolies of the Gilded Age, the oil companies, the railroads, the steel trusts, with a ferocity that earned him the nickname Trust Buster. He believed corporations had grown too powerful and needed to be brought to heel by the government. He established the National Park System and protected over 230 million acres of public land. He built the Panama Canal. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating the end of the Russo-Japanese War. He was loud, brilliant, opinionated, and exhausting, and almost everyone who met him came away slightly dazed. His record has shadows. He held views on race typical of his era that we rightly find troubling today. But as a shaper of the modern American presidency and of the idea that government could be a force for ordinary people against concentrated power, he stands very tall. Theodore Roosevelt, one of the greats. 27. William Howard Taft, The Reluctant President. The man who followed Roosevelt had the misfortune of being compared to him constantly, and the further misfortune of not particularly wanting to be president. William Howard Taft, the largest president in American history at over 300 pounds, was pushed into the role by Roosevelt himself, who believed Taft would carry on his agenda. He did not quite. He was more conservative, more cautious. Roosevelt came to despise him and ran against him in 1912, splitting the Republican vote and handing the presidency to Woodrow Wilson. Taft's revenge was that he eventually got the job he actually wanted, Chief Justice of the United States, a role he held with great distinction. He is the only person to have served as both president and Chief Justice. He was a better judge than a president, and he seems to have been happier for it. 28. WODOWWLSON, The Idealist's Tragedy. The 28th portrait is stern, professorial, the face of a man absolutely certain he is right. Woodrow Wilson was a university president and academic before becoming governor of New Jersey and then president of the United States. He was brilliant, moralistic, and inflexible, qualities that led to both his greatest achievements and his greatest failure. He led the country through World War I, bringing an isolationist America into the conflict in 1917, with the vision of making the world safe for democracy. After the war, he proposed the League of Nations, the first attempt at a global body for maintaining peace. His 14 points were idealistic and visionary. Other world leaders in Paris watered them down brutally. And then the Senate refused to ratify American membership in the League. Wilson refused to compromise. He took his case directly to the American people on an exhausting national tour. He collapsed from a stroke in October 1919. For the remaining 17 months of his presidency, he was largely incapacitated. his wife Edith essentially managing the flow of government. The League formed without the United States. Without American engagement, it was too weak to prevent the next catastrophe. Wilson's legacy is also deeply stained by his racism. He resegregated the federal government, screened the Ku Klux Klan propaganda film Birth of a Nation at the White House, and betrayed the black Americans who had hoped his lofty ideals applied to them. A complex, tragic figure, capable of great vision and great cruelty simultaneously. 29. Warren G. Harding, the beloved disaster. Warren Harding looked like a president, tall, handsome, silver-haired, warm and friendly at parties. He was also spectacularly unqualified and spectacularly corrupt, or rather, his administration was. Harding himself may not have been corrupt so much as incapable of recognizing it in the men around him. The Teapot Dome scandal, in which government oil reserves were secretly leased to private companies in exchange for bribes, became synonymous with his presidency. Multiple cabinet members went to prison. Harding died in office in 1923, possibly of a heart attack. There were rumors of other causes, none were ever substantiated. He was enormously popular while alive. History has been less enthusiastic. 30. Calvin Coolidge, the Quiet One. Silent Cal, the 30th president. Calvin Coolidge was so famously taciturn that a dinner party guest once bet she could get more than 2 words out of him. "You lose," he said. He was a true believer in minimal government, low taxes, and staying out of the way of business. The 1920s economy boomed under these conditions, and Coolidge got the credit. He chose not to seek re-election in 1928, famously announcing, "I do not choose to run." His successor would preside over the crash of 1929. History has debated ever since how much the policies of the Coolidge years contributed to what came next. 31. Herbert Hoover, the unlucky technocrat. The 31st president is a brilliant man who was perfectly suited to every challenge except the one he faced. Herbert Hoover had been one of the most admired men in America before becoming president. He had organized food relief efforts in Europe after World War I that saved millions of lives. He was a great humanitarian, a great engineer, a great organizer. Then the stock market crashed in October 1929, 7 months into his presidency. Hoover's response was inadequate. He believed in voluntary cooperation between businesses and local relief efforts rather than direct federal intervention. He was ideologically opposed to what would eventually become the New Deal. As unemployment soared past 25%, as families waited in breadlines, as Hoovervilles, shanty towns named bitterly after him, spread across American cities, he held the line on his principles. He was voted out in a landslide in 1932. Hoover lived until 1964, spending his long remaining years attempting to rehabilitate his legacy, serving in various capacities, genuinely useful again in his old age. He was not a bad man. He was the wrong man for the wrong moment. 32. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Colossus. We stop again, another long pause. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He is the only president to have been elected 4 times. He served longer than any other, over 12 years, from 1933 until his death in 1945. And the challenges he faced, the Great Depression and the Second World War, were greater than almost any other president has confronted. He came from a wealthy New York family. He was handsome, charming, politically gifted. Then at 39 he contracted polio and lost the use of his legs. He spent years attempting to recover, swimming relentlessly in warm springs in Georgia. He never walked again unassisted, but the struggle remade him, gave him a patience and an empathy that those who knew him before said he had not always had. He became governor of New York, then president, defeating the broken Hoover in a landslide. He arrived in Washington and immediately began the New Deal, a torrent of legislation in his first 100 days that attempted to stabilize the banking system, put people back to work, and give ordinary Americans some protection against the worst cruelties of the market. Social Security, the FDIC, the SEC, the Federal Housing Administration, programs and institutions that are still with us. Did the New Deal end the Depression? Economists debate this still. What it did, undeniably, was restore hope. And then the war came. Roosevelt navigated the United States through World War II with a skill and steadiness that was extraordinary, building the alliance with Britain and the Soviet Union, managing the production of the greatest military in history, making decisions of impossible complexity with the knowledge that millions of lives depended on him. He was not without failure. The internment of Japanese Americans was a shameful act carried out on his orders. He moved too slowly on behalf of Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, the contradictions of a man fighting fascism abroad while allowing racism to flourish at home. He died on April 12, 1945, in Warm Springs, Georgia, having his portrait painted. He had a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 63. He did not live to see the end of the war he had done so much to win. Franklin Roosevelt, one of the 2 or 3 greatest presidents in American history, possibly the most consequential. 33. Harry S. Truman, the unexpected giant. The man who followed Roosevelt had large shoes to fill, and almost no one thought he could do it. Harry Truman was a Missouri haberdasher-turned politician who had been vice president for only 82 days when Roosevelt died. He hadn't even been told about the Manhattan Project. Suddenly, he had to decide whether to use the atomic bomb. He decided yes, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the end of the war in the Pacific. Historians argue about that decision still. The lives saved, the invasion of Japan would have been catastrophic. The lives taken, over 200,000 people instantly. The precedent set for the nuclear age. Beyond the bomb, Truman proved to be an extraordinary president. He desegregated the military by executive order, a landmark moment in civil rights. He oversaw the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Western Europe. He established NATO. He recognized the State of Israel within minutes of its declaration. He stood firm in Korea when the Soviets tested his resolve. He left office deeply unpopular. History revised that verdict dramatically. He is now consistently ranked among the near-great presidents. "If you want a friend in Washington," he famously said, "get a dog." Harry Truman, the man nobody expected, who turned out to be exactly what was needed. 34. D. Eisenhower, the steady hand. The 34th portrait is that of a general who had won the greatest military campaign in history, and then chose, in the presidency, to be quiet about it. Dwight Eisenhower commanded the Allied forces in Europe during World War II. He oversaw D-Day. He accepted the German surrender. As president, he could have been imperial. Instead, he was calm, steady, and strategic. He ended the Korean War. He kept the United States out of Vietnam when advisors pushed for intervention. He built the interstate highway system. He established NASA in response to the Soviet Sputnik launch. He warned, in his farewell address, of the growing power of the military-industrial complex, the alliance between defense contractors and the military that could, he feared, distort American priorities. It was a remarkable thing for a general to say. His record on civil rights was inadequate. He moved slowly, reluctantly, but he did send federal troops to enforce the integration of Little Rock schools. Eisenhower, the steady hand, often underrated, often exactly right. 35. John F. Kennedy, the myth and the man. The 35th portrait is the one that stops people in hallways. John Kennedy. He was 43 when he became president, the youngest elected, the first Catholic. He was handsome, witty, and spoke in a way that made people feel that something important was happening. His presidency lasted 1,036 days. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was the moment the world came closest to nuclear war. Soviet missiles in Cuba, American blockade, 13 days of extraordinary tension. Kennedy, cooler than almost everyone around him, found a way out, a secret deal. The missiles came down, the world did not end. He launched the space program with the goal of reaching the moon. He began tentative moves towards civil rights legislation. He faced down the Soviet Union in Berlin. And on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, he was shot and killed riding in a motorcade. He was 46 years old. What would have come next, in Vietnam, in civil rights, in the Cold War, we do not know. We have only the myth of what might have been, polished by grief into something close to perfect. The reality was more complicated. He was also a man of considerable recklessness in his personal life, a president who sometimes moved too cautiously, a leader still finding himself. But what was real was the loss, and the country has never entirely recovered from it. 36, Lyndon B. Johnson, the tragic contradiction. The 36th president is large in his portrait, overwhelming the frame. Lyndon Johnson is the great tragic contradiction of 20th century American politics. He was a Texan, a bully, a man of enormous ego and enormous capacity for cruelty toward those around him. He once held meetings while sitting on the toilet. He named his ranch, his daughters, and his dog all with his initials. He was, by many accounts, difficult to be near. And yet, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Medicare, Medicaid, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Great Society programs. No president since FDR did more to expand the rights and protections of ordinary Americans. And Johnson, a Southern senator who had spent decades blocking civil rights legislation, did it because he understood that the time had come and that it was right. He pushed, maneuvered, threatened, cajoled, and legislated with a ferocity that was uniquely his. And then there is Vietnam. He escalated and escalated again, 58,000 American dead, millions of Vietnamese, a war he privately doubted but publicly defended, a war that consumed his presidency and his legacy. He chose not to seek re-election in 1968. He died in January 1973, one day before the peace agreement was signed. Lyndon Johnson, the man who made America more just and also the man who made it bleed. 37, Richard Nixon, The Ruin. The 37th portrait is the one everyone leans away from slightly. Richard Nixon was, in some ways, a remarkable president. His opening to China in 1972 was a geopolitical masterstroke. He established the EPA, he ended the military draft, he signed arms control agreements with the Soviet Union. And then there is Watergate. A break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, a cover-up that went all the way to the top, an 18.5-minute gap in an audio recording, the Saturday Night Massacre, impeachment proceedings beginning. On August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon became the only American president to resign from office. He boarded a helicopter on the White House lawn, turned at the door, and gave his strange double V victory sign to a crowd that was not cheering. He had betrayed the trust of the office and the people. He knew it. The country knew it. "I am not a crook," he had insisted. "History disagrees." He lived until 1994, attempting always to reclaim some measure of dignity, sometimes succeeding, but the shadow never quite lifted. 38, Gerald Ford, The Healer. The 38th portrait is the face of a decent man who walked into an impossible situation and did his best. Gerald Ford was never elected president or vice president. He was appointed to both positions after his predecessors resigned or were forced out. He was, quite literally, an unelected president. He pardoned Nixon a month into his presidency. It may have been the right decision. It ended the immediate crisis, allowed the country to move forward, but it cost Ford enormously. Many believed it was a deal. Ford maintained until his death that it was not. He served 2 years, lost the 1976 election to Jimmy Carter, and spent his remaining decades as an elder statesman of quiet dignity. "Our long national nightmare is over," he said when he was sworn in. He helped make that true. 39, Jimmy Carter, The Good Man. The 39th president is often considered one of America's best ex-presidents and one of its more disappointing actual presidents. Jimmy Carter was a Georgia peanut farmer, a former naval officer, a deeply religious man of genuine personal integrity. He brought honesty back to the White House after the Nixon years. His presidency struggled, inflation was rampant, the energy crisis was paralyzing, and then 52 Americans were taken hostage in Iran and held for 444 days, a crisis that defined his final year and destroyed his re-election chances. What came after was remarkable. Carter threw himself into humanitarian work, building homes with Habitat for Humanity into his 90s, monitoring elections around the world, negotiating conflicts behind the scenes. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. He became the longest-lived American president, dying in December 2024 at the age of 100. History has been gentle with Jimmy Carter. He deserved that gentleness. 40 Ronald Reagan, the great communicator. The 40th portrait radiates something: warmth, certainty, the easy authority of a man who always knew his lines. Ronald Reagan was an actor before he was a politician, and he brought to the presidency a gift for communication and story that was unmatched in the modern era. He came to power on a wave of conservative optimism. Government was not the solution, he said. Government was the problem. He cut taxes, increased defense spending, and confronted the Soviet Union with a directness that alarmed many, and he believed helped accelerate its eventual collapse. The economy recovered dramatically after the painful recession of the early 1980s. It's morning again in America, his re-election ad said, and many Americans felt that it was. The shadows, the AIDS crisis, which his administration responded to with unconscionable slowness. The Iran-Contra affair, in which officials secretly sold weapons to Iran and funneled the proceeds to rebels in Nicaragua, clearly illegal, clearly known at some level. The growing inequality of the Reagan years, the beginnings of the economic divergence that still marks American life. And the question of what Reagan knew and when, in his later years. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in 1994, 5 years after leaving office. There are historians who believe the symptoms were present earlier. Ronald Reagan, a transformative president, a genuinely beloved figure to millions, a record that requires honest accounting of both its lights and its shadows. 41. George H.W. Bush, the last of the old guard. The 41st president is often underappreciated by those who came after him. George Herbert Walker Bush was the last president to have served in World War II, a Navy pilot who was shot down over the Pacific and rescued by submarine. He was a man of a particular generation, restrained, dutiful, disinclined to drama. His foreign policy was masterful. He managed the end of the Cold War without triumphalism. He assembled a broad international coalition to push Saddam Hussein's forces out of Kuwait in the Gulf War of 1991, a campaign conducted with precision and stopped at exactly the right moment. His domestic policy suffered. He broke his famous pledge, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and raised taxes in a budget deal that was probably fiscally responsible and almost certainly cost him re-election. He was defeated by Bill Clinton in 1992 in an election that turned on the economy and the unexpected candidacy of Ross Perot. He died in 2018. His son sent him a letter saying, "When I get to heaven, the first one I want to see is you." George H.W. Bush, a man of decency and genuine competence, undervalued in his time. 42. Bill Clinton, the wasted potential. The 42nd portrait is charismatic, even in oil paint. Bill Clinton was extraordinarily gifted, intellectually brilliant, politically gifted, capable of connecting with people from every background in a way that was almost supernatural. He genuinely loved policy. He genuinely loved people. He presided over a period of extraordinary economic expansion. The budget went from deficit to surplus. Crime rates fell. Welfare was reformed. He was a centrist in a moment when centrism had appeal, a new Democrat who declared that the era of big government was over. And then there was Monica Lewinsky, and the lies and the impeachment. Clinton's affair with a White House intern and his subsequent lie about it under oath consumed the second half of his second term. He was impeached by the House, acquitted by the Senate. He finished his term. History judges him as a president of significant achievement and significant personal failure. The two things cannot be separated and perhaps should not be. He remains one of the most naturally talented politicians America has produced. What might have been, with a different set of choices, is one of the more melancholy what-ifs in recent history. 43. George W. Bush, the weight of decisions. The 43rd president arrived in office under contested circumstances. The 2000 election decided by the Supreme Court after a recount in Florida that turned on thousands of disputed votes. He had barely found his footing when September 11, 2001 arrived, and the world changed. His response in the immediate aftermath was steady. His approval ratings reached 90%. The nation felt briefly united. And then came the decisions that would define his legacy. The invasion of Afghanistan to dismantle al-Qaeda and the Taliban, initially successful, ultimately the longest war in American history, ending 20 years later in chaotic withdrawal. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, based on intelligence about weapons of mass destruction that turned out to be wrong, hundreds of thousands dead, the destabilization of the entire Middle East, no weapons found. Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and the failure of the federal response that left thousands of mostly black and poor Americans stranded in New Orleans for days while the government struggled to react. And the 2008 financial crisis, which arrived in the final months of his presidency. George W. Bush carried an enormous weight in his post-presidential years. He took up painting. He seemed, by most accounts, to have genuinely reflected on the costs of his decisions. History is still writing his chapter. 44. Barack Obama, The Promise. The 44th portrait is the one that carries, even in paint, a particular weight of history. Barack Obama became the first black president of the United States in 2008, elected in a moment of economic crisis and national yearning for something new. He inherited the worst financial collapse since the Great Depression and a country fighting two wars: the Recovery Act, the auto industry bailout, the Affordable Care Act, which extended health insurance to millions who had never had it, the most significant expansion of the American social safety net since Lyndon Johnson. He ended combat operations in Iraq and wound down the war in Afghanistan, though both conflicts continued in various forms. He ordered the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. He restored America's international standing after the Bush years. His presidency had its critics from both sides, those who felt he did too little, those who felt he overreached. He governed in an era of intense partisan polarization, facing a Republican opposition determined from day one to deny him any legislative victories. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009, early in his first term, in a decision that even he acknowledged was premature. What Barack Obama represented, the son of a Kenyan father and a white mother from Kansas, raised in Hawaii and Indonesia, becoming President of the United States, was something the world watched with a kind of wonder. Whether his presidency lived up to that promise is a question each American answers differently. 45. Donald Trump, The Disruption. The 45th portrait is unlike any other in the hallway, louder somehow, more primary colors. Donald Trump was elected in 2016 in a result that shocked most political observers. A real estate developer and reality television star with no prior political experience, he defeated Hillary Clinton in the Electoral College while losing the popular vote. His presidency was defined by disruption. He withdrew from international agreements, the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He pursued an America-first foreign policy that unsettled traditional alliances. He enacted significant tax cuts. He appointed 3 Supreme Court justices. The economy performed strongly before the COVID-19 pandemic struck in 2020. The pandemic response was deeply controversial. The country suffered enormously. Over 1 million Americans died. He lost the 2020 election to Joe Biden. He refused to accept the result. On January 6, 2021, a mob of his supporters stormed the United States Capitol, interrupting the certification of the Electoral College results. 5 people died. It was the first time the Capitol had been breached since the British burned it in 1814. He was impeached twice, the only president to be so. He was acquitted both times. He ran again in 2024 and won, becoming the 47th president, the first convicted felon elected to the office, the second person in history to serve non-consecutive terms. His chapter, in every sense, is not yet finished. 46 Joe Biden, The Bridge. The 46th portrait is of a man who has known extraordinary personal loss, a son, a daughter, a first wife, and who has somehow kept going. Joe Biden served 36 years in the Senate and 8 as vice president before becoming president at 77, the oldest person ever elected to the office. He withdrew American forces from Afghanistan in 2021, ending the 20-year war in a chaotic, painful conclusion. He passed significant infrastructure legislation. He oversaw an economic recovery from the pandemic that outpaced most predictions. He provided extensive support to Ukraine following the Russian invasion of 2022. He ran for re-election, then withdrew from the race in July 2024, the first incumbent president since Lyndon Johnson to do so under similar circumstances, clearing the way for his vice president, Kamala Harris, who ultimately lost to Donald Trump. History will take some years to fully understand his presidency. Closing the long hallway. And so we reach the end of the hallway. 46 portraits, 46 stories. Farmers and generals, lawyers and professors, men of great vision and men of terrible smallness, men who rose to the moment and men who could not. What does it all mean? Perhaps this, that a nation is not one person, not one president, not one decade or one decision or one triumph or one failure. A nation is a long story, told across generations, with many authors, many mistakes, many moments of grace. The hallway is long, the portraits are many, and each one in their way is part of a story still being written. You have walked the whole length of it tonight. Let the history settle around you like dust in old light. Let the names grow quiet, Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, all of them, dissolving gently into the comfortable dark. There is nothing left to do tonight. No decisions to make, no history to carry. Only sleep, soft, deep, dreamless sleep. Good night.